morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could ask people to take their seats, please. We have quorum, so I'll call the fifth meeting of the Executive Committee to order. Just going to raise this chair up. I feel like I'm sitting on the floor. I think Councillor Cressy comes in and lowers it down each time before the meeting. Just all right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I will remind people they can watch us on YouTube at Toronto City Council Live or follow the meeting on computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If so, please indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. Seeing none, I'll move along. May I have a motion, please, to confirm the minutes of the Executive Committee meeting held on April the 9th, 2019?
So moved.
Moved by Councillor Ainsley. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Okay, I would like to add an item of new business to our agenda. The proposed item, which has been circulated, I believe, on pink paper, is the initiative to reduce the number of unwanted firearms in Toronto. I understand you have the item before you. May I ask for a motion to add the item? I've moved it, but may I ask all those in favour of adding the item? In favour, opposed, carried. I'm quite happy to move forward and ask if, unless there's some discussion, I had been unaware that there was people, there's no deputations or anything else people wouldn't have known. Anybody unwilling to proceed to the question on the item? It's simply to put the budget in place for the gun buyback that is underway, and I should say so far 300 plus people have called the police to say they have guns to turn in, so it seems to be working. So I'll just call the question if people are happy with that. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Let's then proceed to run down the agenda of the meeting, and item EX 5.1 is Ontario Place Exhibition Place Revitalization. I know that you have some questions, Councillor Cressy, so all right, I'll see if there's anybody who wants to hold it. If not, we'll just... Pardon me? No, I have a motion to put on that, and so it's a motion that's... Has it been pre-circulated, Julie? It hasn't. All right, then we'll hold it down, and I don't think we'll have a long time. There's no deputations on, but we'll hold it down. Item EX 5.2, Lessons Learned, Third-Party Advertising. You have questions, Councillor Nunziata? We'll hold it for Councillor Nunziata. Item EX 5.3 is being held for deputations. Item EX 5.4, 2019 capital budget adjustments for carry-forward funding. Moved by Deputy Mayor Min and Wong. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item 5.5, Toronto Water 2018 year-end capital budget, and 2019-2028 capital plan adjustments. Maybe I have somebody move that item. Moved by Deputy Mayor Min and Wong. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item 5.6, Toronto Zoo Financial Authorities bylaw proposed revisions. Are you moving that item, Councillor Ainsley? All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Okay, so that would bring us back to the Ontario Place Exhibition Place Revitalization, and the first thing I'll ask then is whether they're... Sorry, Councillor Cressy, yes. No, it's fine. I was just going to move to questions of staff and start with you. So we'll move to questions of staff, and we'll start with Councillor Cressy.
Just two questions of staff. First, to our Chief Planner, does the City of Toronto own some of the land within the Ontario Place grounds, the 155 acres?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, we do. We own land and portions of the water lots. Okay.
And complementary to the motion in front of us here today from the Exhibition Place Board, is there the results on the Ontario Place Subcommittee, is there a report also coming to the same council meeting on this item?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, there is a report coming from TE 5.27 that will be considered at the same City Council meeting.
And are the two complementary to each other?
Yes, they are.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions of staff on this matter? All right, well then I'll move to those wishing to speak, and again, turn to you first if you wish, Councillor Cressy.
Well, thank you, Mayor, and a few brief remarks as the local councillor here. Ontario Place, and for that matter, Exhibition Place, have been in the news a fair amount recently. It goes without saying that Ontario Place, being 155 acres of publicly owned land, some of which is owned by the province and some of the city, in the heart of Toronto, isn't living up to its full potential. And you only get one chance to revitalize it, and thus it is critical that we get it right. And what I think is so important about the motion in front of us here today, which I'm fully supportive of as a member of the Board of Exhibition Place, and the motion coming from the Ontario Place Subcommittee, is that while the province owns most of the land, they don't own all of it. And more than that, the land requires significant collaboration at Ontario Place with ours in Exhibition Place. No level of government, the city or the province, can go it alone. We won't succeed. We won't get it right. And so we have in front of us here a recommendation from Exhibition Place, which has been reaffirmed again and again and again for 20 years, to look at both parcels of land as a precinct. We should do that. What's critical, though, to get it right is when we look at both parcels of land as a precinct, we need clear principles and public policy objectives to guide that overarching precinct. And so coming to council will be both this recommendation from the Exhibition Place Board, which I'm fully supportive of, along with the results of the Ontario Place Subcommittee that established the principles upon which the city would enter into a joint process. Principles including public access, connection to the waterfront, heritage preservation, expanded parkland, arts and culture, and year-round animation. And so there is an opportunity here to get it right. There is also a risk that we get it wrong. And thus, as we move forward, I think this is not without risk when we choose to go it jointly, but I think it is the wise approach because the future of these two grounds is worth giving it our best shot. Having them both separate and sitting fallow isn't acceptable, nor is having each of them redeveloped or reimagined on their own separate from the other. And as the local councillor, I'm fully supportive of this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cressy. I didn't turn on the clock, but you showed admirable discipline in being well under what would have been less than 5 minutes.
Unusual for me.
Thank you very much. All right, are there others wishing to speak on this matter? Okay, I will because I have a motion to move it. Have we circulated this as well? My motion?
We haven't circulated your motion, we can put it on the screen.
Pardon me?
We haven't circulated your motion, we can put it on the screen.
All right, so if we can put it on the screen, but I would like people to have a chance to read it. It is not, I mean, it is a motion that simply follows along with the same spirit of saying to the province that we want to work with them, and it takes, so you can see it in front of you, and it really just makes an amendment to give some further direction. Of course, it will be discussed at council to the city manager to engage the province on various matters that are not inconsistent with some of the documents, the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan, Exhibition Place Strategic Plan, Festival Plaza Master Plan, and this is consistent with the wishes of the Exhibition Place Board as well, who considered a motion very similar, if almost identical to this. So it's really just taking forward and trying to pull together the thoughts and work of the subcommittee, the thoughts and work of the Exhibition Place Board, and the thoughts and work of the rest of us that weren't included in either of those, and move this process forward. So you can read it while I just speak for a minute, because I want to just really echo some of the words and maybe make a small additional statement beyond what Councillor Cressy said, and he's been working away at this, and I appreciate that as the local councillor. I think one of the most important things he said was that we have to get it right. Perhaps he laid a little bit of less emphasis than I might on the fact that there has to be genuine collaboration here, genuine collaboration. And I think the genuine collaboration is both sort of required and necessary. The required part speaks to the fact that, as Councillor Cressy pointed out, and as Mr. Linturn indicated in answer to the one question, we actually are landowners on the Ontario Place site. And so while the bulk of the site is owned by the province of Ontario, we own a piece of it. And so that requires our collaboration in order to determine a plan, unless you somehow managed to do a plan that was somehow avoided that piece of land. But the second thing that I want to say very clearly is that significant collaboration is highly desirable if you want to achieve a genuinely integrated plan for the renewal of this site, only because we are the sole owners of the piece of land across the street, namely Exhibition Place. And I think there are many desirable aspects to looking at this as a precinct, as a neighborhood, as an area of the city that could be renewed in a magnificent fashion, whatever that means in the context of whatever emerges for this plan. And I simply want to say that there are two ways that this could be done. It could be done by a series of legislative fiats and orders and regulations and the like, or it could be done in collaboration, genuine partnership with the city. And I think through these motions, we are indicating that we're reaching out the hand of genuine partnership. But that means the views and the concerns and the rules and the planning frameworks of the city are going to have to be respected, not to the point where when you're in a negotiation that you get it all your own way, but to the point where our views are respected. Because the other thing that I'll say beyond whose land is whose on these different parcels, it's our city. It is our city. It's the capital city of the province of Ontario. Ontario Place was and could be again a magnificent attraction that's an important part of our city, but it is part of our city. And it's on our waterfront. And I understand the joint feelings of stewardship that the province and indeed the federal government feel about the waterfront. And we have, I think, operated in a successful partnership on many occasions with those other governments to get things done for our waterfront. But the fact remains, it's our waterfront. And so I just want to say that I'm looking forward to, and I've had discussions directly with the Premier about this. It was me who initiated the discussions. I can tell you exactly where we were standing when we did it on the Exhibition Place grounds and said we should work together on this. But I really just want to make the point that working together means working together. It doesn't mean responding to letters or emails or anything like that. It means working together to sit down and map out something, if we possibly can, that is going to be for the benefit of the people of Toronto and Ontario and Canada, but recognizing that it has to be a real partnership with genuine collaboration. And so that's all I wanted to say, and the motion is meant to achieve that. It is put forward in that spirit, but I think it was necessary also to say that it was put forward in that spirit that it should be a meaningful collaboration and not a collaboration in name only. So I will stop there, and if anybody else wants to say anything before we call the question on this motion and the recommendations, the amendment. Anybody else? Going once, going twice? All right then. I guess we'll deal first then with the, where do I have my copy of that motion? It's on the screen, or do we have, there it is. With the motion to amend recommendations 1 and 2, moved by me. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And then the item as amended, all those in favor? Recorded vote is fine. Thank you.
On the item as amended, all in favor, Mayor Tory, the Deputy Mayor Minnan Wong, Councillor Bailao, Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Thompson, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Nziata. That carries unanimously.
Thank you. Okay, so we had then held, Councillor Nziata had held item EX 5.2. Lessons learned, third-party advertising in the 2018 municipal election. And are there any other councillors visiting with us that are not members of the committee that had questions of staff on this? Seeing none, we can move to you, Councillor Nunziata. Thank you.
Questions. So in the 2018 municipal election, there were a total of 8 formal complaints.
Yes,
there we go.
that's correct.
Is that Uli that I hear answering? There she is. Okay, we just had to find you in the room. There you are. Thank you.
And can you tell, will you be able to tell us what the complaints were?
No, we cannot discuss those here.
Well, you can't. So you're,
What I can say, though, is that generally they would involve several matters, one of which would be very often determining whether, in fact, they fell within the definition of third-party advertising, which has a fairly limited definition in the Act.
So the complaints that were received, were there any, what action was taken on the 8 complaints?
Well, in the case where the complaints came from people who said that people hadn't registered, we would take action on following up with them, and where they were in fact third parties, they did register and we were able to take care of those. In some instances, the Act allows us the ability to deal as a municipality with signs that don't comply with the requirements. Those were dealt with by MLS, and they would have followed up with those. The other complaint mechanism was a council-approved mechanism that allowed complaints to be followed up with an external law firm who would be able to investigate, because these first would be discussed with the city manager and the city solicitor to determine whether they were actual breaches, and if we weren't quite certain, they would be forwarded to the third-party external law firm, and they would be followed up and investigated.
So
We have one of those still underway.
okay, so in your report, you're also suggesting there's a few areas where legislative amendments may assist to strengthen an enforcement. So you're having dialogue with the province on those various amendments?
We have suggested some amendments to the province, yes.
Now, does the city do we have the authority to opt out?
No, council made that request in the report that they looked at earlier in 2018, and they do not have that authority. The province did not grant the city that authority, which was requested.
Okay, but is there an opportunity to request it again for the next election? They may reconsider?
Yes, council or executive committee can make that recommendation.
Thank you.
Other questions of staff on this? May I just ask one, just to be very clear on what Councillor Nunziata was just asking about. Did I hear you say that there is going to be a review of some kind, or they're going to be looking for comments generally from us, and that within that context there would be the opportunity to ask for an opting out? Or by what means do we just ask for an opt-out, if for example, if we wanted to have that change made to this legislation?
Through the chair, council can certainly request an opt-out from the Municipal Elections Act. I think it would be highly unlikely. The province feels quite strongly that this is an appropriate regime. Prior to the MEA including third-party advertising in its legislation, third-party advertising was permitted but not regulated, and there were no contribution or spending limits. And the policy underpinning third-party advertising in the Act is really around public transparency and financial accountability. And the province and the federal government all have third-party advertising regimes in their election legislation.
And I'm glad you clarified that, and I thank you for that. And I guess I would only go on to say that I think sometimes people who are looking for an opt-out are looking for a situation in which effectively you'd go to a regime where third-party advertising was banned, and was prohibited. And I'm assuming that the reason this is here is because the province's lawyers, and perhaps our own as well, had concluded that it was not possible under the Charter of Rights and otherwise to prohibit it, so therefore you were better off to regulate it as opposed to leaving it unregulated as it was before.
That's correct.
Okay, so by answering Councillor Nunziata the way you did, the clerk did, we're saying we can write a letter to them, I guess, and pass a resolution as a council anytime we want on anything, which we often do, and it goes on deaf ears. But we could do that in this case, and that there is no process by which they've said they welcome those or invite those or they'd be willing to consider those seriously. We could do it, though, just because we could.
Yes, we can. A council certainly can do that at any point, and I, as clerk, after every election, take a look at what happened and what didn't happen and what worked and didn't work with the MEA, and by my own authority, independently of council, I also make recommendations to the province, some of which they follow up on and others they don't.
That was my final question, actually, because I was going to say our staff have obviously observations I'm sure they would make with respect to the things that Councillor Nunziata was asking about in terms of complaints and things that went on, and you do have the authority and would feel free to use it to send off a letter to them in your capacity to sort of say, we think you might consider these improvements, and you could do that without having a long council discussion on it.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Mayor.
Fine, thank you very much. Are there any people with any further questions of staff? Okay, then we can move to speakers if there are any.
Don't really need to speak. I know it was an issue in some of the wards, and some of the councillors had issues. So that's why I wanted to hold it down, ask questions. And as it was mentioned, we can at any time ask the province again, because I know there was a motion when it first came through council for us to opt out on it, and we have that opportunity in the future. But I found that in the last election there were very serious issues in some of the wards and some of the councillors. They're not here today, but they might discuss it at council. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Councillor Nunziata. Are there any other members of council wishing to speak? Okay, then I will call the question. Of course, the recommendation here is simply that the report be received for information, and we've heard all of what the clerk is going to be doing in her own regard. All those in favour of the recommendation? Opposed? Carried. Okay, that brings us to item 5.3, and before we begin with the deputations, there are 16. I would simply say this, and I'm saying this to all deputants regardless of what their point of view is on this. Last time we were here discussing this, the discussion, I'll call it degenerated, and I'll use that word into words like racist being thrown around and that kind of thing. And I will not tolerate that this time. People can come and they can make deputations. We are not here to have a discussion of the foreign policy of Israel or any other country. We're here talking about demonstrations and so-called hate sponsors rallies that take place in the City of Toronto, and about the kind of way in which they're dealt with by the city government and some of the laws surrounding that. And so I would just ask people to be considerate of what I've just said in terms of trying to avoid some of the kinds of things we got into last time, and it occurred on different parts of the room. But I will also say that I won't hesitate to just conclude somebody's deputation and turn off their mic if they're trespassing on this this attempt to sort of remain civilized in here and have a thoughtful discussion about an issue that I think a lot of people take seriously. So, on that note, I would ask that the first deputant come forward, and that is Michael Mostyn, B'nai B'rith, Canada. Good morning, Mr. Mostyn. I think you know the rules here. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Mayor Tory. And just preliminarily, thank you, Mayor Tory, once again for your support for diverse communities in Toronto, and particularly the Jewish community, which just last week, under Toronto Police hate crime statistics, were again the most targeted group for hate crimes in the City of Toronto. Our organization, the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, released our audit of anti-Semitic incidents for last year. For the first time since we have been conducting this audit since 1982, we had over 2,000 incidents of anti-Semitism which were documented. This is a disturbing trend. This is 3 years in a row, an increase in anti-Semitism. It is a very serious problem, and it is a very serious problem across the country and in the City of Toronto. Just last weekend, we all saw a terror attack on a synagogue just outside of San Diego. These incidents, violent incidents, do not happen in and of themselves. There are violent words and incitement, and it leads to action, and it leads to real-world consequences. We cannot allow, in our City of Toronto, hate rallies which incite against any identifiable groups. Yet, we are here today, more than 2 years after this hearing first started into this matter of hate rallies, and we have had 2 reports. And in the second report, which came down, key questions which have been put to city staff by this executive committee remain unanswered. And this is just not acceptable. It's not acceptable. And in fact, the anti-discrimination policy of the City of Toronto should have governed this entire discussion. So it's very disappointed that it has taken this long. Our recommendation, just to begin before I get into everything, is that this report should again not be accepted, should be sent back, and cost recovery options should be discussed for 2019 should in fact an Al-Quds Day rally take place again in the City of Toronto. An affidavit was filed last time by one of the organizers of the Al-Quds Day organizing committee by the lawyer for Al-Quds Day. I do have, and I would like to submit to the executive committee to be read and by city staff, detailed refutation of all of the major issues on there. This rally has been awash in anti-Semitism for years. It has been investigated regularly by Toronto police. And regardless of whether or not criminal charges have been laid in the past, that is not the standard to be looked at. It is the anti-discrimination policy of the city, and my affidavit, I would respectfully submit, makes that crystal clear, that there is continuing and ongoing violations, and something needs to be done about it. It cannot be allowed to continue. This is also a public safety issue. If I myself as an individual were to walk down University Avenue and block traffic illegally with no permit, I would be taken off the streets, particularly if I was waving the flag of a listed terrorist organization in this country. Yet for some reason, 5,000 people in an organized mob that have flags of terrorist groups have been permitted to march down, where there are 3 city hospitals. This is an arterial road as designated by the City of Toronto, and God forbid some ambulance was not able to make it to the hospital in time. What would be the legal liability of this city? And it was not addressed, once again, in this report. It was addressed in terms of permitting for parks and permitting for Nathan Phillips Square. But what about how do we deal with city streets, and particular, very, very important arterial roads? So this is a matter of public safety, and it needs to be considered. There is freedom of speech in this country. We must all recognize the freedom of speech, whether we agree with it or not. But there is also a freedom to be free from incitement to hatred. And that has to be equally balanced, and it's not being balanced currently. This is in clear violation of the anti-discrimination policy. I would turn everyone's attention after the fact to this affidavit. It's awash in anti-Semitism. It is in direct contravention of the City of Toronto's hate activity policies and procedures. There are a number of self-contradictory statements. In the previous affidavit, I would turn everybody's attention to that. Platforms have been given to Holocaust deniers. It is clear. This has been documented in the public press. I'm uncertain why we are returning to this matter so many times. And we really do need to pull the pin on this with all due respect. Hate rallies cannot be permitted to take place in this city. And we need to do something about it this year. It just cannot, with the elevation of hate that we see globally, and Canada is not immune to global trends, we simply cannot allow inciting behavior in our country and in our fair city. So those are my remarks, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mostyn. Are there questions of the deputant? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stephen Ellis. Morning, Mr. Ellis.
Good morning.
5
How are you?
minutes.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, good morning. My name is Stephen Ellis, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on this matter. I appear before you as a human rights lawyer and as a Canadian citizen. And as such, and as a person deeply immersed in the field of human and constitutional rights, I'm greatly concerned by this process. As today is also May Day, I make the following remarks in the spirit of May Day. Equal rights for all. For months and months and months, we've heard this hysteria about Al-Quds being a hate fest from people like Mr. Mostyn, Sue Ann Levy, Councillor Pasternak, and their friends in the JDL. And to its disgrace, in my opinion, City Hall has given these people carte blanche to slander the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. When we were before you on March the 21st, I think it was, and back in November, we insisted that this matter is a pretext to discourage legitimate criticism of apartheid Israel, and we were right. Now we have the latest report from the executive director, and it tells us something quite unremarkable. The police concluded there was no hate speech uttered at the last Al-Quds rally, but of course you knew that. But that's the thing about free speech. It means nothing unless it applies to speech you don't like. Al-Quds is a target not because they have engaged in hate speech, but because they have engaged in speech that you hate. That's why we're here. This is a pretext with a capital P, and in my opinion, those who support this referral ought to be ashamed. In my opinion, this city has a racism problem, and I'm going to talk about racism. For years, City Hall has been deeply imbued, in my opinion, with an anti-Palestinian racism. The circus around Queers Against Israeli Apartheid and the Pride Parade bears this out. So let me test this out with a hypothetical. Over several years now, there has been an annual ceremony raising the Israeli flag here at City Hall. Here's the test. If members of the Palestinian community requested that you also raise their flag, what would you do? Would you grant that request? I think it's safe to say that Councillor Pasternak would be quite upset at the idea, to say the least. And the usual cast of characters, the B'nai B'rith, Sue Ann Levy, and the JDL, would be quite beside themselves at the thought of the Palestinian flag flying over City Hall. In any event, we know full well what the response would be, should such a request be made. City Hall, in my opinion, has a racism problem. I'll go even further. Not only is the city racist against Palestinians, but the city won't even permit Palestinians to talk. I'll wrap it up. Okay. I think my comments are relevant, and I'd like to continue, sir, if I could. Okay.
Told you as well at the beginning that if we have to terminate your deputation because you won't listen to the request of the chair.
I consider myself
So I'm
warned.
asking you to consider carefully what you're saying today.
Not only should Palestinians have to suffer illegal occupation, land theft, and humiliation on a daily basis, but they should also shut up about it, lest they be accused of engaging in hate speech. This is a very entrenched problem. This is gaslighting of a very pernicious kind. The attack on Al-Quds is an attack on Palestinians. And please don't think Palestinians haven't noticed. Let me take this opportunity to put City Hall on notice of a human rights complaint soon to be filed against it by members of the Palestinian community. It alleges that the city and members of council, by falsely and maliciously accusing them of hate speech, have discriminated against them contrary to Section 5 of the Human Rights Code. More about this will be revealed at a press conference in the coming days. It isn't too late, however, for the city to start doing the right thing. How about going after real hate mongers? There are real hate organizations out there preaching real hate month after month down on University Avenue. They preach a hate that very directly leads to acts of violence against Muslims.
10 seconds, Mr. Ellis.
Why aren't they before you today defending themselves? In fact, you have one bona fide hate organization on the list of deputations today, the Jewish Defense League.
Okay, I think that, again, that's going off into the territory. You don't need to characterize other deputations that are taking place
It's just a
here.
fact.
So I think, and I gave you an extra 20 seconds because I had interrupted you to...
I'll wrap up.
Well, no, you have wrapped up. That's it.
Oh,
That's it.
fine.
I do want to ask you a question, though, and that
Sure.
is simply this. When you say equal rights for all,
Yeah.
would you assume that equal rights for all also mean equal responsibilities for all in terms of following the city's anti-discrimination
Of
policy?
course.
Okay, and secondly,
Yeah.
you think when we talk about equal rights for all, it also would apply to the necessity that exists under city law to get a permit to have a demonstration or an event on city property?
I think if you can get a permit, that's advisable.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, sir. Where's my list? Next is Dimitri Lascaris. Good morning. Mr. Lascaris, you have 5 minutes. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, sir. As you know, councillors, I'm legal counsel to the organizers of the Toronto Al-Quds rallies. My thanks to the Executive Committee for affording me the opportunity to speak here again today. On March 17, 2019, after months of careful inquiry, Toronto City staff delivered its response to Councillor Pasternak's crusade, because that's what it is, to curtail my client's constitutional rights to free speech, free assembly, and free association. Staff's investigation included the compilation of a survey sent to stakeholders. The advice of legal experts was sought. Various departments of the city's administration were consulted. At the end of this laborious process, staff's answer was clear. The city's existing policies and practices with respect to hate speech were sufficiently robust. But Councillor Pasternak was not satisfied, and regrettably on March 21, 2019, this committee supported his efforts to prolong this crusade and to stifle my client's criticisms of an egregious human rights violator. As a result, the city expended even more of its precious resources on revisiting the issue. Staff in the People, Equity and Human Rights Division consulted with colleagues in corporate security, municipal licensing and standards, parks, forestry and recreation, the Office of Emergency Management, Economic Development and Culture, Legal Services, as well as a superintendent from Toronto Police. Based on this extensive additional work, staff delivered another report to this committee on April 15th, and here are the core findings, and I'm quoting, "The city's current policies regarding hate activity are robust and adequately address the aim of preventing hate speech on public property. City staff believe that its current policies clearly condemn discrimination and prohibit hate activity in a manner which respects the freedoms of peaceful assembly and expression as contained in the Charter. Second, and I'm quoting again, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms identifies the following among the guaranteed fundamental freedoms: freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. The city is legally obligated to respect those rights. Third, on the specific question of cost recovery, staff wrote, the Executive Committee has specifically asked about the feasibility of the city addressing non-permitted protests that feature hate speech by seeking recovery of associated costs. Any cost recovery must not infringe the right to use public space for expression as protected by the Charter." And as you've heard by my fellow member of the bar, Stephen Ellis, there was another revelation in this report, and that is that the police, multiple police officers, and a superintendent, following a complaint which, in our view, from B'nai B'rith contained a series of malicious falsehoods about my clients, examined the statements made at the June 2018 rally and concluded that no hate crime had been committed, despite all of the rhetoric that we have heard about hate speech allegedly being disseminated at the rallies in the past, including the June 2018 rally. The Toronto Police have spoken. Multiple officers and a superintendent reviewed the statements made at the Al-Quds rally. As we know from the scandal enveloping the Trudeau government around the SNC-Lavalin affair, it is inappropriate for elected officials to interfere with the administration of justice and to apply political pressure on officers of justice and administrators of justice to act contrary to the judgments that they have made independently after their exercise of due diligence. Now, at the last hearing, I believe it was March 21st, we heard a proposal from the Center of Israel and Jewish Affairs about how to deal with the Al-Quds rally. And I'm quoting, there is a need for a new policy to manage the use of city space. That policy should require groups to first obtain a permit. Groups that do not do so or that violate the terms of the permit by promoting hate and glorifying violence should be penalized with a substantial fine. Why is this proposal unconstitutional? Because in my submission to you, it is. It would undoubtedly have an extraordinarily chilling effect on free speech. Let's take the example of that was Mr. Mostyn cited, of somebody holding up a Hezbollah flag at an Al-Quds rally. And let's assume for the purposes of argument that that is a form of hate speech. Now, in an assembly of thousands of persons in a public space, despite the exercise of reasonable diligence, it is impossible, simply impossible to guarantee that some person isn't going to engage in some form of hate speech, such as the display of a Hezbollah flag. Now, if you're an organizer of this rally, and you are effectively going to assume responsibility for such acts of isolated hate, which you did not approve, then you're not going to apply for a permit, and you are not going to expose yourself to that liability. It is simply impossible for there to be a guarantee that anybody in a large gathering of thousands of people in a public space isn't going to engage in some form of hate speech. The other problem with this, okay, the other problem with this is if you're applying, again, put yourself in the mind of an organizer who's applying for a permit, you may have a different view of what constitutes hate. There are people, for example, who support Israel who believe that calling Israel an apartheid regime, even though it's been documented by international legal scholars,
Okay,
is a form
I
of
think
hate
we've
speech.
gone far enough. You were just trespassing off into the usual. So in terms of just getting off into, I think you've said your piece and you've had your 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Laskaris. Other questions? Thank you very much. Michael Kiefer.
Mr. Kiefer is not here.
Well, if Mr. Kiefer's not here, then we move on.
Thank you.
Who are you then? Sorry.
Robert Massoud.
Oh, so you're next, Mr. Massoud. Thank you very much. So you have 5 minutes. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. My name is Robert Massoud, and with other volunteers, I ran the much-missed activist meeting space and independent community gallery called Bates Atoon House, located in iconic Mirvish Village before it was razed for development. Out of that experience, I became very close to civil society in Toronto and witnessed its power, big-heartedness, and wisdom. I wish to share that perspective with you today. The Executive Committee has occupied itself for 18 months with this proposed motion. Apart from its weaknesses, including disregard of our constitutional freedoms, perhaps its greatest shortcoming is that it fails the citizenry and the city. Apart from aligning Al-Quds Day, the main rationale for this motion, if not the main mechanism of enforcement, is a demand that Al-Quds play by the rules, i.e., pay fees and costs like other users for events on city property. Examples given were corporate ventures or commercial opportunities, such as parades and marathons, sponsored by banks and real estate companies. Yes, they can afford to pay their way. We must ask whose rules and for whose benefit. The motion, advanced with mystifying determination, fails the city and civil society because at its core it views the primary role of government as facilitating business opportunity and coordinating economic development. It puts civil society at the same level of business and demands that it earn its keep. The takeaway message to ordinary people is, your voice has no place in this city if you have no bucks. This is the equivalent of installing a paywall on our streets. And we have seen the damage done by paywalls to the flow of information and the ability of ordinary people to participate. We have to ask, how does a paywall on our streets benefit the city? This motion does not value civil society. We all agree that the function of government is to care and nurture for the life of its residents in all material aspects, but its function also includes ensuring and encouraging an engaged spirit among its citizens. This is best done through civic education, responsibility, and participation for a true civic life. Creating opportunities for hotel bookings and alcohol sales, as do the sponsors' events, does not achieve that goal. Any level of government misses the mark when it fails civil society. Please ask yourselves, how can we best encourage true civil society as a co-participant, as a co-creator in the life of this city? And also, does this motion do that? It is no secret that Toronto is perennially strapped for cash, and City Hall looking for ways to keep it afloat. I suggest that a modest investment in development of a strong civil society pays huge dividends. An informed and empowered civil society would not allow Toronto to be kicked around by Queen's Park or Ottawa. Civil society is good at creating solutions. Every city is blessed with creative and committed people of all ages and backgrounds working in civil society to make astonishing things happen with zero budget and zero resources. Civil society can be City Hall's greatest ally. Bylaws which restrict freedoms throttle civil society. Mr. Mayor, councillors, I encourage you to tap into this inexhaustible source of civic energy and creativity. In closing, civil society is at its best when it seeks justice and when it helps state institutions save themselves from themselves. An enlightened city works to encourage its citizens' rights to seek a larger scope of justice in its midst and halfway around the world. Finally, if this motion is about combating hate, then know that time and again, history has shown that a strong civil society is the most effective bulwark against hate. In my opinion, this motion is bad for civil society, bad for Toronto. I urge this committee to heed the staff report issued by the Office of People, Equity and Human Rights. Longer term, may I suggest that the office's role be expanded from simply ensuring that the city conforms with human rights law to include proactive engagement and development of civil society for the general good of Toronto. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on this important topic.
That is exactly 5 minutes. So you certainly complied with the rules. I thank you for that. Are there any questions of Mr. Massoud? Okay, hearing none, I thank you very much for being here and for your respecting of the rules. Dr. Atif Kubursi, Canadian Arab Federation. Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good
Thank
morning.
you for coming. You have 5 minutes.
Sure. Good morning, Your Worship, honorable members of the Executive Committee, councillors. I come to you as a emeritus professor of economics from McMaster University and former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, as being the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. I'm coming here today as a representative of the Canadian Arab Federation. It's an umbrella organization of many grassroots Arab, Canadian Arab, and Muslim communities. Let me state right at the outset, we stand shoulder to shoulder with our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community, in the First Nation communities, in the Black communities, and all communities that have suffered, continue to suffer racism, discrimination, violence. There is no place for violence and hate in this country, and I'm proud to be part of it, and I know there is no place for this in this great city. But we're coming here to talk about trying to marginalize, in effect, and penalize our community for daring to speak about the injustices, infractions that have been committed against the Palestinian people and the oppression that is meted to these people on a daily basis. We are here basically and fundamentally to state that this rally, we've seen it and continue to feel that it has an obligation to educate and share our views with our fellow citizens and Canadians about the many infractions of international law that is committed and are committed on a daily basis. Under international law, no state has any unfettered license to treat inhabitants and to deplete natural resources of the territories under occupation. Rather, its powers are regulated and constrained by international law and acceptable international norms. Under international law, an occupier is not a sovereign. He's only a temporary administrator. Therefore, he has no right, the occupier, to deplete the territory of its resources.
Sir, I want to make sure I give you your time, but again, we're here talking about, events that take place in the City of Toronto and how hate speech relates to those events and how they're conducted. So if you could slowly make your way back to that.
Your Worship, I'm trying to say that our...
It's a very interesting dissertation on international affairs, but not something we're here...
No, absolutely, but there is a question here that by disallowing...
If you could move to that question, that would be super. Thank you. You go ahead. I'll give you a little extra time because I interrupted you.
Thank you. All what I'm trying to argue here is that we have a responsibility here to stand with our fellow citizens to express our dissatisfaction, unhappiness, that the infractions of international law are being exercised, and we have no right under the proposition here and proposal to stop this rally from expressing these views. Basically and fundamentally, we consider that denying our right to protest and to assemble and to criticize and to conflate our criticism of Israel with hate and anti-Semitism is totally unacceptable. You have heard from the police, you have heard from so many groups, the Attorney General of Ontario. Our position here is please do not add one extra layer of bureaucracy and appoint yourself in any way, shape, or form to decide whether we have the right to protest what we consider to be major infractions. And it's our duty to share with our brothers and sisters the protection, the human rights of people, wherever they are, but equally being ourselves denied the human right to express ourselves in a way that would mute our voice, marginalize us. We are a community that are at danger here. We are, in many respects, subject to violence, hate, equally to all our brothers and sisters in many other communities. And we're probably number 2 all the time. If you look, and there are a number of these infractions that are not reported. What we are really talking about is our right to speak our mind, our human right to express our feelings and our position, and to plead with the city and the council not to deny us this right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Are there any questions of the deputant, Dr. Kubersi? Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and see us today.
Thank you.
Jake Javanshire. Good morning, sir. I think you've heard how the rules work, and
Yes,
so you have
I do.
5 minutes, and you're welcome this morning here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jake Javanshire. I am Jewish and lived in Israel for 20 years. Most of my immediate and distant family reside there. I'm a member of a Unitarian congregation and also a member of a group of Unitarians from across Canada, which is more socially active in all areas of justice, freedom, and human rights in Canada and elsewhere. I became aware about Israel-Palestine in the 1970s, slowly discovering that all I knew as to how Israel came about was based on myth, untruth, and propaganda. I would like to emphasize that I am much immersed in this history and have much knowledge on a daily basis. As such, I'm very troubled by it, especially being a Jew. Now, fast forward to the subject at hand today. I attended 2 Al-Quds rallies, and I say with all honesty that I did not hear a language of hate. Repeatedly, speaker after speaker announced, "We are for Judaism, but against Zionism. Jews are our brothers and sisters, and we are grateful for the ones who are among us." It was chanted repeatedly, Judaism yes, Zionism no. Now, I will not say that perhaps never an inappropriate language was used by anyone, because I did not attend all. But is it a good reason to shut the whole event? I'll be the first one for eradicating hate or violence against any group or religion. But I ask you one thing. Let's not convolute criticism of Israel or the colonial ideology of Zionism with hating Jews or anti-Semitism. I like to say to Mr. Pasternak and like-minded people, defending Israel 110% and silencing any criticism is not serving justice. Israel done and doing endless atrocities. In 1967, there was not one settler in West Bank. Now there are 800,000 taking over most fertile land. Recently, sharpshooters killed 300 people in Gaza.
Mr. Mayor,
Again,
point of order.
First of all, 2 comments, sir. One is what you do with respect is direct your comments to the chair. We don't have people addressing comments to each other any more than we would direct them to you in that way. And secondly, as I've said, I want to caution you about getting off into a discussion of what may or may not be happening in international affairs and in different things. We're here to talk about the City of Toronto, dealing with events that take place in the City of Toronto and how that interacts with free speech and our regulation of all kinds of different events and so on, and not to have a discussion because for you, if you put that on the table, then everybody else is simply going to come and respond to that. And so I just ask you not to go down that direction. It's not the United Nations here, it's the City of Toronto Executive Committee. Okay?
I understand that.
Thank you,
The only thing, I have one paragraph here.
Well, maybe you could skip that paragraph and go
No,
to the
let
next
me
one that
just say
deals
what it is.
with something
It's
that actually is
about-
going on in the City of Toronto. We're here talking about the City of Toronto.
Okay, but it
Okay?
happened actually
Well, I'm not
that
going
the
to debate you,
doctor
sir.
was
You
here
go
from
ahead.
Israel.
You say what you want, but I'll stop you if you, again.
Okay.
So I'll allow you a little bit of extra time because I've interrupted you, but please proceed.
By the way, by international law, occupied people have the right to resist occupiers by any means. We all know too well that anywhere, if an academic or politician, Jew or non-Jew, spoke or wrote anything unfavorable to Israel, lost his livelihood, his name smeared, and no one will hire them due to fear of retaliation. I would like to say that there are many, many thousands of Jews in Israel and all over other countries which are against the policies of Israel and against silencing tactics used by the Jewish lobby. Majority are silent out of fear. Orthodox Jews participate in rallies like El Quds Day or after an Israeli massacre, saying that Israel should not take over the land by violent means. I ask this committee not to stifle this event, a lonely, peaceful voice of resistance to Israel's ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem. Palestinians everywhere have the right to be heard. It's our duty to defend it. We will be complicit to Israeli crimes by shutting down this event.
Okay. I think that we've hit the 5 minutes, and I think you were, again, heading down the same road after a couple of requests not to do so. So I think we'll say that's it. That's 5 minutes, and I thank you very much.
Sorry, the rest of it has nothing to do with
Well,
anything.
that's what you told me the last time, but so I think we'll just say thank you very much for being here. We appreciate that.
One last sentence.
Well, one last sentence, but just try and be respectful by making it not one that makes me regret
problem.
the fact that I allowed you the one
Okay,
last.
that's it. Please, to this committee, please do the right decision today, not a decision based on where the power and influence lies.
Thank you very much. The power and influence lies with the people and the people that were elected here. So anyway, there you go. Thank you very much, sir. All right. We have next Jamila Cotter.
Thank you for having me today.
Good morning. Thank you for coming, and you have 5 minutes.
Please let me know. I didn't time it exactly, so let me know when it's 5 minutes, please. So I am here on behalf of the University of Toronto's Graduate Student Union, on behalf of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Committee at the GSU. We are an organization mandated by the students at the University of Toronto to respond to the Palestinian civil society call for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the Israeli state until it complies with international law in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly laws pertaining to the Convention on Apartheid, the Geneva Convention Against Torture, and international law pertaining to the treatment of children. That is the mandate of our organization that has existed for about 5 years. We have been voted on about 12 times at different meetings of the membership at the University of Toronto, and have received hundreds of votes over that period, which indicates that the perspectives and views on Palestine, as articulated and expressed at the Al Quds rally, are not marginal at all, actually. They have become mainstreamed in many ways and have broad appeal and involve large sectors of the City of Toronto and large sectors of Canadian society. I want to give that a sense of the impact of your decisions today and how broad they are. I come from a constituency that is concerned about the impact of your decisions on our organizing and our participation, particularly the fact that this will have a chilling effect on organizing around Palestine. and particularly human rights advocacy for Palestine. At our own university, we have dealt with a series of attacks and efforts to criminalize our organizing, including by the Jewish Defense League that has often come onto our campus and shut down our events, to the point where the University of Toronto administration has banned a member of the JDL from coming to campus. This is an example of a chilling effect, but I want to give you a small example of hundreds I could provide you, because I am trying to show you the larger context of our conversation today, which is that there is something that has been identified as the Palestine exception, including by human rights organizations, the Center for Constitutional Rights in the US, as well as the Canadian Liberty and Civil Society organizations. The Palestine exception is that many number of groups or organizations may or may not commit what a Palestinian solidarity organization is accused of, but it is the Palestinian solidarity organizations that's targeted to the exception of all others. As we all know, there are many unpermitted rallies that happen in the city. And as we all know, there are expressions of hate that take place in many different contexts. And it's very unfortunate. I would love a city of Toronto that robustly persecutes every time a Nazi flag is raised in the city. Of course, these are things we need to discuss. But the concern and the optics and the perception of what it means when that's all taking place in our city, but then it's Palestine that's made an exception. Well, that's been documented. And that is what I am here to entreat you to consider, how the context of your decisions today, whether or not you want it to be, are unfortunately part of that larger context. And it's a profoundly social and human rights context. It is definitely about freedom of speech and expression, and that should protect the most provocative and controversial views first. What's the point of it if it's not protecting what is provocative and controversial? What's the point of it? It's about just protecting the normative, the dominant, then what does it mean? We're very concerned. I think this has an impact on students at the University of Toronto, at Ryerson. There are many universities and colleges in the city. And of course, Toronto is, people come here because they feel there's this open environment in students and things like that. So I would also like to raise to you to consider, maybe there is a component where this conversation has to be broadened in some way to engage the student bodies who are actively part of Al-Quds rally organizing, who are doing this kind of advocacy work. Maybe there's a place for that, because academic institutions, they're very precious places, and students and different things. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Ms. Cotter, are there any questions for this deputy? Okay, no, thank you. There aren't. Thanks so much. Karen Brothers. Good morning, Ms. Brothers. Thank you for being here. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I've been involved in interfaith education on the Israeli-Palestinian issue since the early 1990s. As a member of the Near East Cultural and Educational Foundation, a member of the United Church, an associate member of Independent Jewish Voices, and a founding member of the United Network for Justice and Peace in Palestine and Israel, I've attended many Al-Quds Day rallies and have been invited to speak at several. No one supports hateful speech. But this motion labeling Al-Quds rallies as hateful, besides, I believe, defaming Al-Quds Day, is aimed at those only describing the Palestinian situation. In effect, it not only criminalizes the victim and peace activists, but it erodes charter rights, and it hinders our government's ability to honor its legal obligations on this issue. Educational rallies such as Al-Quds Day are in the public interest, and many believe a moral imperative. The hate speech rallies motion assumes that criticizing Israel is illegitimate. So what justifies accusations against Israel? Very briefly, 2004, the International Criminal Court confirmed that Israel was militarily occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. In 2009, the Human
Point of order,
Sciences.
Mr. Mayor. They've been warned repeatedly.
Yeah, again, we're asking again that we not have a, I mean, again, we're here to talk about events that take place in the city of Toronto and the regulatory framework around that and the policy implications of that here in the city of Toronto. So if you could confine your comments, again, if there's going to be a debate about foreign policy, it can happen in the proper place.
I think this is very relevant because it describes
okay, but I think,
what people are complaining about. This describes what what gives us legitimacy. The legitimacy.
All right, so
of what we're talking
I've asked
about.
you to do something that I think is consistent with what we're here to do, and so you'll listen to my request, which I made at the beginning and in the middle and again now, and so if you comply with it, that would be great, and if you don't, we'll have to consider whether we let you continue. So there you go. Please
Well,
continue.
I'll just say, Israel has been declared guilty of apartheid, crimes against humanity, war crimes.
All right, again, that's, so
Some
if you
years
move
ago,
on from that now, otherwise I'm going to thank you and terminate your deputation.
No, wait a second. I attended the 2 previous hearings. While about a dozen spoke to this issue, only 3 supported it. They represented the JDL, which the FBI recognized as a terror organization, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs in B'nai B'rith, which I think you can describe all of them as agents of a foreign government. I appeal to every member of the Executive Committee to support Canadian interests by rejecting this motion. It's in Canadian interest to support our charter rights, to support our government's legal obligation to support human rights. And I would say, in what other situation of war crimes and crimes against humanity are the victims and peace activists criminalized rather than those committing the crimes?
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of the deputy? Okay, thank you. Mr. Derek Moran, please. Morning, Mr. Moran. You know the rules here. You have 5 minutes.
My mom called me Derek. I just want to say, by me speaking at this meeting, this shall not be deemed to be in any way my consent expressed or implied. In doing so as fraud. God bless Her Majesty the Queen, and long live Her Majesty the Queen. And let the record show I do not consent to the unconstitutional searches violating Section 8 of the Constitution Act 1982 that are currently taking place here at Toronto City Hall, as the province has never given the City of Toronto express statutory authority to do this. Now, Mayor Tory, I know the importance that you place on precedent case law, because I know I've heard you say it on the John Moore Show and with Farah Nasser. So in that spirit, I just want to let you know that yesterday at the Langenfeld appeal, Justice Rulo, exasperated with Lerner's lawyer Cynthia Kuehl, asked her, do you have any case law, any evidence to back up what you're saying? So I actually brought the case law on what the Supreme Court of Canada has said about hate speech before. So this is from Suresh versus Canada, Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, 2002. It is established that Section 2 of the Charter does not protect expressive or associational activities that constitute violence. This court has, it is true, given a broad interpretation to freedom of expression, extending it, for example, to hate speech and perhaps even threats of violence. At the same time, the court has made plain that the restriction of such expression may be justified under Section 1 of the Charter. The effect of Section 2B in the justification analysis under Section 1 of the Charter suggests that expression taking the form of violence or terror or directed towards violence or terror is unlikely to find shelter in the guarantees of the Charter. This is Supreme Court of Canada, R versus Keegstra, 1990. Where, as in this case, an activity conveys or attempts to convey a meaning or message through a non-violent form of expression, this activity falls within the sphere of the conduct protected by Section 2B, like these people that have been interrupted by you, Mayor Tory, about 4 times. They've been expressing non-violent forms of expression. This section protects all content of expression, irrespective of the meaning or message sought to be conveyed, no matter how offensive it may be. The government's purpose in enacting Section 319.2, I guess that's the statute they were talking about in this case, was to restrict freedom of expression by curtailing what people may say, as we've seen about 4 times already here today. Supreme Court of Canada, Ross versus New Brunswick School District Number 15, 1996. Apart from those rare cases where expression is communicated in a physically violent manner, this court has held that so long as an activity conveys or attempts to convey a meaning, It has expressive content and prima facie falls within the scope of the guarantee of freedom of expression. The scope of constitutional protection of expression is therefore very broad. Rather, freedom of expression serves to protect the right of the minority to express its view, however unpopular such views may be, such as my view that I think this place lies to members of the public that we can't ask questions when we come here. The Court of Appeal for Ontario in Bracken versus Fort Erie, 2017, as expressed in Irwin Toy versus Quebec Attorney General, 1989, citing from the Supreme Court of Canada, freedom of expression was entrenched in our Constitution and is guaranteed so as to ensure that everyone can manifest their thoughts, opinions, beliefs, indeed all expressions of the heart and mind, however unpopular, distasteful, or contrary to the mainstream. Such protection is, in the words of both the Canadian Quebec Charters, fundamental because in a free, pluralistic, and democratic society, we prize a diversity of ideas and opinions for their inherent value both to the community and to the individual. And I just want to point out, Mayor Tory, something that I mentioned at the police board that you and Councillor Pasternak came up with at the last City Council meeting, where you, let's see, City Council once again reaffirmed its support for freedom of religion and expression and further state its opposition to any legislation that would restrict or prohibit such freedoms. And by doing so, Toronto states its position that the city continues to be a source of worldwide inspiration. That means when you come to these meetings, guaranteed freedom of expression means you don't have to stick to the topic. You can say whatever you want. Were you aware at any point, Mayor Tory, that Councillor Shelley Carroll was subjected to harassment allegedly while she was a member of the Toronto Police Services Board? Is that a question I should ask of Chair Pringle? Because you know I asked him that 3 times at the last police board meeting last week, and he looked really angry when I was asking
On
him
that
that.
note, we've reached 5 minutes, and we thank you very much.
It is my time.
Reputation.
I
Thank
don't
you
want to
very
hold
much.
anyone else up.
Thanks very much for coming by, Derek. Okay. Meyer Weinstein, Jewish Defense League. And sir, I'll remind you of the same caution that I expressed to the other deputants at the beginning of the meeting and throughout. So please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to address you and give testimony regarding Al Quds Day.
The clock's going. Oh, I'm sorry. That clock is the front one here that I'm looking at is going. Sorry, it must be. Let me just start it again and see if it resets both. There we go. Okay, yeah, this one was going. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to express myself at this session regarding Al Quds Day. I'm a son of Holocaust survivors, and you know it's been a very difficult past few days. There was an attack on a synagogue in San Diego. Gunshots, rabbi shot at, person dead, injured people. There's been an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. I have some experience dealing with hate propaganda. It was my evidence, which was key, that was used to prosecute Nazi propagandist Ernst Zundel and ultimately led to his deportation from Canada. I monitor all the many organizations that are involved with Al Quds Day. One organization rep who's here today, his group provided a platform for a person called Ken O'Keefe. Ken O'Keefe is on record referring to Jews. It's on video on YouTube. The effing Jews. And this person was given a platform here in Toronto to speak with a BDS group. Let me just read from my notes. First off, I consider that calls for the destruction of Israel, the one little tiny Jewish state in the entire world, to be anti-Semitic, to be the epitome of anti-Semitism, calls for the destruction of the state of Israel of any size. At an Al-Quds rally 2018, a cleric rose to the podium and he said, "We pray to the Creator and to Almighty, a day will come when we will see justice throughout the world, the eradication of unjust powers such as the American Empire, such as the Israeli Zionists." Another speaker at the rally said, "We are gathered here today to condemn Israeli war crimes, to stand against the extreme racism by settlers who believe they have a God-given right to oppress the Palestinians, as God has chosen the Zionists as the superior race." Chants at the rally, "Death, death to Israel." At 2017 Al-Quds Day, 2 cameras documented a song that was played that's from the Islamic Jihad movement, a banned terrorist organization. And I testified last time, just over a year ago, about that. And part of the lyrics are, "Behead them, stab them, run over them." In 2015, at an Al-Quds Day rally in Toronto, a cleric addressed the assembly there for Al-Quds Day. "We're obsessed with ISIS, we're obsessed with ISIL, we're obsessed with Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Nusra, Al-Shahab, so on and so forth. We consumed our energy towards the branches of the tree, while we don't realize that every other branch is going down to the root. And the root of any act of injustice in this world is Zionism. If you want to uproot the oppression in the world, I ask you now to uproot the tree of Zionism today. Down with Zionism." Oh, well, there you go.
Just carry on, sir.
Another cleric addressed the assembly, said, "The Zionist ideology is anti-human. The Zionists are against humanity. Their end is coming near." In 2013, Al-Quds Day, the former chairman of Palestine House here in Toronto addressed them. He said, "You have to leave Palestine. We will restore justice. We say, get out or you're dead." We give them 5 minutes. Like I said before, I'm a son of Holocaust survivors. I take calls for the eradication, the elimination of the state of Israel of any size to be the most vicious anti-Semitism today. There's approximately 6.5 million Jews living in Israel. We lost 6 million Jews already. We see a resurgence. There was another terrorist attack that was stopped, thank God, by the FBI a couple days ago in California. Planned to plant explosives at Jewish centers. This kind of rhetoric in the streets of Toronto, parading down University, is incitement against Jews.
All right, and I'll ask you to stop, and I'll thank you very much for your comments. And are there any
you.
questions of the deputy? Okay, seeing none, I thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much
for being here. Mariam Karim. Good morning. You're welcome to join us this morning, and you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you all for having me. Good morning. I will be reading a letter on behalf of a few groups at the University of Toronto. On behalf of the University of Toronto's Graduate Student Unions, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Committee, and the University of Toronto's Ontario Public Interest Research Group Students Against Israeli Apartheid, we express our opposition to the silencing of the Al-Quds rally with the proposed motion on, quote, hate-sponsored rallies such as Al-Quds Day, being considered here in today's meeting. This motion violates the fundamental rights of the Al-Quds rally organizers and therefore of all Canadian society to freedom of speech and expression and the right of political dissent and public assembly. These rights, guaranteed and protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as international laws and conventions, apply to the efforts of Al-Quds organizers. These human rights advocates are exposing the Israeli state's violations of international law and its treatment of the Palestinian people under its rule, including the Convention Against the Crime of Apartheid. As students and community members, we are deeply troubled by the City of Toronto's targeting of the Al-Quds rally for suppression and consider the proposed motion a clear violation of freedom of speech. We urge the City of Toronto to uphold and respect our fundamental freedoms and rights by quashing this motion. As students at the University of Toronto, we understand well the value of freedom of assembly and expression for the creation of new ideas and innovation. These basic democratic principles are the prerequisite to the ability of any university or academic institution to operate and flourish. In a city like Toronto, with many schools, colleges, and universities, and a vibrant cultural life, it is particularly important that an open, democratic culture is promoted and no social or political perspective is criminalized. The proposed motion is misguided. Its censorship of important human rights work like the Al-Quds rally and the criticism of the government policies like those of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories sets a dangerous precedent that contravenes the values of inclusivity and diversity that the City of Toronto has expressed its commitment to. Making criticism of Israel as constituting hate speech is misinformed and unconstitutional. It is undemocratic and suppresses important human rights work. It is deeply troubling that our elected officials are suppressing peaceful demonstrations such as the Al-Quds rally that call attention to gross violations of international law and human rights. Too often, the Palestinian perspective is silenced and marginalized, but it is more important than ever that we listen and hear the perspective of a people who have been living and suffering under colonialism for almost a century now. Again, we urge you to affirm the right of the rally organizers and supporters by quashing the proposed motion before you. In doing so, the city would be upholding basic democratic principles, including freedom of speech and the right to peaceful demonstrations. Sincerely, Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions Committee at the Graduate Student Union, University of Toronto, Students Against Israeli Apartheid, Ontario Public Interest Research Group at the University of Toronto. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your deputation. Are there any questions of Councillor Pasternak?
Are you aware that the original motivation of this initiative was to stop neo-Nazis and white supremacists from spreading their ideology on public space?
On what? Sorry? Can you please repeat the question? I can't hear.
The original motivation of what's before us was in response to neo-Nazis and white supremacists gathering on public space.
Are you referring to hate speech? Yeah, of course.
Oh, so you're aware that our response was to white supremacists and neo-Nazis gathering on Toronto public space?
I'm just to confirm your question. Are you referring to the hate? Of course, we need to not have neo-Nazis and white supremacists.
No, we don't want them on City of Toronto property.
Of course.
Would you agree that neo-Nazis and white supremacists are not welcome?
Of course, 100%.
So, but you seem to be supportive of these rallies. I mean, you're here telling us to vote against this package.
The motion refers to...
I'm speaking directly to the Al-Quds rally, which is not what I don't understand. Your question is not related to the Al-Quds rally.
Do you think you've misunderstood what's before us? We're here to stop white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other hate rallies. Now, we don't want them on the City of Toronto, but have you...
Mr. Mayor.
If I may add, please, I am fully aware of the reason for my...
Point of order, Councillor.
Mr. Mayor.
Deputy Mayor.
We're listening to the questions that's being asked by the member of council to the person who's speaking. There's a member in the audience. The gentleman has indicated that he's a lawyer and he is quite well informed as a professional. I would ask you, through you, to direct a response to him to basically just have some good behavior in the...
I will concur in the comments of the Deputy Mayor. There's no way you would do that in a courtroom. You wouldn't speak up and be interrupting the proceedings of the court. You'd be thrown out and cited in contempt.
Mr. Mayor, point of order, please. The gentleman was saying that's a lie. I saw him, saw his action. Yeah. Now he's saying that he's not saying a word.
Regardless of what he was saying, yes, sir, both of you, please sit down, sir. Sit down, or I'll have to ask you to leave. The bottom line is, it doesn't really matter what you were saying. You've had your 5 minutes, and you are now sitting in the audience, and you are to remain silent while others have their chance to. Well, I actually heard the words coming and, okay. All right, that's enough. Thank you very much.
I would like to step down.
That is enough. All of you, please. We're going to proceed, or I'll have to ask the security to clear the room out. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, I just ask you, you're doing now what you wouldn't do in court either. Well, no, I didn't falsely accuse you because you're doing now exactly what I said, which is you would not sit in court as an officer of the court and speak, and nor would you come here to City Hall and interrupt our proceedings. You've had your say, and if I could ask you now just to listen attentively, as we're all trying to do, to these deputants and to the questions, that would be terrific. And so you had asked a question, and you were going to answer.
May I respond to the question?
Yes, you may. And then there's one more question. Go ahead.
Sure. First, I want to add that I am fully aware of the reason of my attendance today, and I am informed of the context. So I would just like to pose it. I don't want anyone to question my intelligence on this, but I would also like to add that, of course, we want white supremacists and neo-Nazis. We don't want them on our streets. And the question is, why are we not targeting the Nazi rallies and the white supremacist rallies? We're here today to speak about the Al-Quds rally. And that's what the letter was regarding.
All right.
And I would like to step down, please.
I'll just wrap up. Just one last question. So there's nothing here that bans these rallies. We don't want them on city property. They don't conform to our respectful, tolerant society. So you seem to be a voice of U of T. Would you like to host these rallies on U of T grounds? You've got lots of geography in and around Queen's Park Circle. Do you want to reach out to these groups and maybe you want to host them?
Sure.
Well, then
I was speaking about the Al-Quds rally.
The white supremacists should call you.
Excuse me, please do. That's not what I said. I'm feeling slightly attacked here. First, my intelligence was
indeed, Councillor Pasternak, I didn't hear a question there, and we are supposed to be asking questions respectfully.
I'd like to step down, please.
You can make one last comment, and then I think we're done. So you go ahead.
Sure. I would just like to say I was speaking specifically about the Al-Quds rally. Of course, we don't want neo-Nazis and white supremacists on our city floors. Please do not do this. Our letter was very clear. We support Al-Quds rally, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have Noah Shack from the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I think you've heard how we would like to see these proceedings conducted this morning, and so I'd ask you to comply with those requests, and you have 5 minutes.
Happily. Thank you very much. My name is Noah Shack. I'm here presenting on behalf of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, the advocacy agent of UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. The issue with regard, I'd like to address just a couple of the comments that have been made here today before I get into a more constructive conversation. You know, the issue that we have with what has transpired at a number of these rallies relates to members of our community being referred to as inhuman, bloodsuckers, a disease that is spread, a cancer that must be killed. And I encourage members of the council, of this committee and the council, to take to heart the unequivocal condemnation a week ago by the Director of Education from Peel District School Board of a vicious blood libel that was perpetuated over there. These are insidious allegations. And you heard another one here today. According to the international definition of anti-Semitism, which is endorsed by the Government of Canada, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel than to the interests of their own nations is anti-Semitic. I don't mind being offended or criticized. I think our community has a pretty thick skin, and we're resilient. But there is a line, and when it gets crossed, it needs to be acknowledged. The last time we presented to Executive Committee, we proposed 3 constructive elements to modify the existing policy regarding events held in public parks and squares. First, demonstration organizers should be required to obtain a permit from the city prior to holding an event or a demonstration in a park or square. In addition to securing the shared goal of preventing hate rallies from using our cherished city spaces, such a policy would also enable the city to ensure proper management of such spaces and prevent competing or conflicting events from taking place in shared spaces. This is a matter of good governance and efficient management, not only of preventing the promotion of hate. However, this kind of a policy would only be effective if event organizers who do not obtain such a permit are subject to a significant or meaningful administrative penalty. We're open to an appeals process, an exemption policy to be used in exceptional cases where, for legitimate reasons, an organizer shouldn't be penalized, but the absence of a clear policy requiring permits needs to be addressed. The second is that the permit application should explicitly state that the promotion of hatred against any identifiable group, incitement to violence, or other criminal activity constitutes a violation of the terms of the permit, and event organizers can be subject to a significant or meaningful penalty if they fail to uphold these terms. Third, the permit application should state that the city retains the right to deny permits when it reasonably believes the event organizers will not or cannot uphold the terms and conditions of the permit, just as the Toronto Public Library reserves that right with regard to library space when they believe an individual group will be using that space for the purpose that is likely to promote or would have the effect of promoting discrimination, contempt, or hatred for any group on the basis of many factors, including race, ethnic origin, place of origin, creed, or citizenship. The report in front of the committee includes information about the city's hate activity policy and the declaration of compliance required to obtain a permit. Illogically, this is not required in the case of rallies or protests for which permits are not issued. Permits are not required for such events at Nathan Phillips Square or other city facilities, and the city does not issue permits for rallies or protests in parks because they are prohibited. And yet, there are no significant penalties for these incidents, which do occur, sometimes even inside residential neighborhoods, to intimidate local residents. In any case, those who sign and violate the Declaration of Compliance, which is only required in limited circumstances, are still not subject to a fine or any other penalty. The city's made it clear that hate has no place in our municipal spaces. This is a laudable intent, and it's reflected in the library's policy clearly, but it's not mirrored in policies governing the use of the city's outdoor spaces. We recognize the desire to preserve charter rights and freedoms, which we all hold dear. The same charter, of course, notes that fundamental freedoms are subject to reasonable limits as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Clearly, the library's policy reflect this understanding, and our hate speech laws are in place and have been tested and are legitimate. The distinction between the management of library space and other iconic spaces that are open for the public use seems tenuous at best and doesn't seem to be a reasonable basis to maintain a different policy and standard. This issue has implications far beyond one annual demonstration. Events in recent weeks, including hate-inspired
wrap up, sir.
mass violence in Christchurch, Sri Lanka, San Diego, remind us that bigotry is not restricted to one place, one community, and it's important that we take action.
Thank you. Are there any questions of this deputant? Okay, hearing none, I'll thank you very much for your deputation. Let's see now. That brings us to Suzanne Weiss. Good morning. You have 5 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. We're loud and clear.
Honorable Mayor Tory, ladies and gentlemen of the executive, my name is Suzanne Weiss. I'm a Holocaust survivor. As a Jewish infant, I was marked down for death by the Nazis. All my life, I have worked to prevent another Holocaust through pursuit of social justice and free speech. I have attended rallies sponsored by the Muslim community on Al-Quds Day. These events, in my experience, express support for Palestinians seeking equal rights within Israel and Palestine, and the goal of peaceful reconciliation of Israel and Palestinian people. Al-Quds gatherings stress support of the Jewish people against anti-Semitism. Their banners state, Judaism, yes, Zionism, no. I have heard these words chanted by tens of thousands of people and participants in Al-Quds Day. They define Zionism as a movement to forcibly displace and dispossess the Palestinian people. Al-Quds speakers protest the harsh and murderous actions of the Israeli government against the Palestinian people seeking equal rights. As a lifelong campaigner against anti-Semitism, I am encouraged by the Al-Quds' efforts to explain the distinction between Judaism and Zionism, and to overcome anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist, anti-Palestinian prejudices. Their efforts deserve constructive engagement, dialogue, and respect for their right of free speech. I'd like to affirm the report by Director of People, Equity, and Human Rights. Thank you very much for this privilege of speaking to you today.
And thank you very much, ma'am. Are there any questions of the deputy? Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Weiss. We appreciate your being here today. Fifth, Firas Al-Najim. Is Firas Al-Najim here? Okay. Then that we bring us next to the Reverend Karen Rodman, Just Peace Advocates. Good morning.
Good morning,
I think you've
Mayor
heard
and
how we're trying to
Executive
conduct our discussion today, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Sure, we should start there. The clock's starting. Great. I would like to highlight actually two things from my report. The first actually is to the city manager to say thank you so much to your director and their staff at the People, Equity and Human Rights Office. We really appreciate the work of the public service and the value that we see in that, and that it's been outlined very much in a transparent way, the policy and the processes that are there for all citizens, including those of us who speak in solidarity for Palestinians. We would have appreciated that report back in November 2017 or even in March of this year, but we are pleased to see that due diligence done by the city. I point out one other thing just to highlight from my report, and it's been mentioned by other deputants, and that is that by public record, there are at least events that have been held by Islamophobic, nationalist, alt-right organizations, many of them right out here on the square, some at Melasman Center, and one planned again for this Saturday just around the corner at 301 University. We note that those are not included in this report, and for some reason everything comes back to talking about Al-Quds. So just to conclude, Mr. Mayor, it is impossible for Al-Quds participants to mount an effective defense of the rallies without discussing the conduct of the State of Israel. Because criticizing the State of Israel is exactly what Al-Quds rallies are about. And yet again and again today, the chair of this meeting interrupted and cut off speakers who sought to explain why Al-Quds protesters criticize Israel. Those repeated interruptions from you, Mayor Tory, unequivocally confirm what Councillor Pasternak's initiative is all about. It is about silencing the criticism of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Rodman. Next is Elizabeth Block, Independent Jewish Voices. Were there any questions of that deputy? Okay, thank you. Elizabeth Block.
Okay, I signed up late. I didn't know you could do that. How nice this is. I want to say, on behalf of Independent Jewish Voices, that these attacks on Al-Quds Day are part of a larger scheme to shut down, delegitimize, and even criminalize criticism of Israel. I would hope that the City of Toronto would not be a party to this. I have been at Al-Quds rallies, not every one, they aren't a lot of fun. Have there been expressions of anger against Israel? Yes. Can't imagine why. Have there been expressions of anger against Jews? Yes. Some of the people there think that Israel represents all Jews in the world, and that Israel and Jews and Israel are synonymous. Well, why do they think this? Because Israel and its supporters have been promulgating this for decades with a great deal of success. The supporters, of course, include B'nai B'rith, CIJA, the Jewish Defense League, all of whom have spoken here today. It's pretty rich for the Zionists, for these Zionists and others who have been promulgating this untruth for years to complain about it now. And as for why Palestinians would complain about Israel, I would hope everybody in this room knows that. If you do not, I tend to wonder what planet you are living on. As for trouble in the police sense at Al-Quds rallies, I would submit that if the Jewish Defense League weren't there, there wouldn't be any. The JDL, this is a bunch of brave men with the courage to threaten women old enough to be their grandmothers. Does Independent Jewish Voices support these events? Well, our policy is if there are no anti-Semitic slogans, signs, chants, yes, we do. And I would say one other thing. This meeting began with a land acknowledgement. What do you think would happen if somebody in Israel, let us say a university professor whose university was built on land that used to belong to Palestinians, started his lectures with a land acknowledgement? I would like to see it happen, but I don't look for it in my lifetime.
Thank you very much, Ms. Block. Are there any questions of this deputant? Okay, thanks so much. Now, I gather Mr. Kiefer, who we passed by earlier because he wasn't in the room at the time his name was called, is here now, and if he wishes to be heard, he can come forward. Mr. Kiefer, there we are. You weren't here, and we were trying to make sure we maintained as... And I should say, by the way, in response to the comment of the one deputant, that had people just been commenting on the difference between speaking about Israel and speaking about Zionism or some issue like that, as opposed to making direct statements about the conduct of anybody, I wouldn't have interrupted. And that's the only things I interrupted today. And I would say the same of you, sir. If you could confine yourself to what we're trying to deal with here today, which is how the city can ensure that its policies and values with respect to discrimination and hate are dealt with in the context of rallies of all kinds, we would appreciate that. Yeah. So please, over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, and thank you, Mr. Mayor and committee members for listening to me. I apologize for my lateness. As you're noted aware, our city recently hosted a public debate between the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek and Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson. It seems to have been quite a big deal. I'm going to begin today by quoting a question posed by Mr. Žižek in one of his many books. Quote, "Why are so many problems today perceived as problems of intolerance rather than as problems of inequality, exploitation, or injustice?" Let me rephrase the question. Why is Toronto City Council's Executive Committee mulling over something that Councillor Pasternak and some others call hate-sponsored rallies, rather than acknowledging that these events might be more accurately described as rallies prompted by Canadian citizens' thirst for justice? My answer would be that people may have been misinformed. I say this with some confidence because the mayor of another Canadian city, Winnipeg, recently brought shame upon himself on the advice of B'nai B'rith Canada by denouncing Palestinian activist Linda Sarsour as a hate-mongering anti-Semite. He said she was not welcome to speak in his city. One of the people who refuted this smear was Rabbi David Miviser, who in a letter to the mayor identified himself as one of 60 members of the Rabbinical Advisory Council of an American organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, which has more than 200,000 members and supporters. and which had invited Linda Sarsour, whom it regards as an important ally in the struggle for justice and peace, to be the plenary speaker at one of its most recent national meetings. Now, I believe that this body has received some prejudiced advice, but you have also, if I may remind you, received countervailing advice. In 2017, from Joseph Hickey, the Executive Director of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, who advised that the proposal for an imposition of prior restraint on so-called hate-sponsored rallies would violate democratic values and, quote, strip individuals of their fundamental human rights of freedom of expression and freedom of association. It is unconstitutional and a violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Canada has ratified, unquote. A report from your own Executive Director, People, Equity and Human Rights, dated April 15th of this year, states that, quote, the city's current policies regarding hate activity are robust and adequately address the aim of preventing hate speech on public property. That same report informed you that Toronto Police did not find anything, quote, fitting the criteria of a hate crime in words spoken at the 2018 Al-Quds Day rally. Pass over some other material. Mr. Mayor and Councillors, I'm fully in sympathy with the project of resisting and opposing hate crimes and the dissemination of hatred, which this is a matter not just of ethics, of equity and of common decency, but also of public safety. But in furthering this project, it's essential to be acting on the basis of facts rather than misinformation. There is, of course, doubt in the minds of many, myself included, that the characterization of Al-Quds Day rally as hate-sponsored has a distinct flavor of Islamophobia. On that subject, I would quote for you a statement by Peter Beinart, one of the most highly respected of American Jewish political commentators, quote, if you foment hatred against Muslims, don't offer your sympathy when hatred kills Jews. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are two symptoms of the same nationalist disease. You either fight them both or you are complicit in them both. In my presentation here on March 20th, I commented that without exception, the recent mass killings in the United States and Canada and elsewhere have been perpetrated by the exponents of white supremacist, extreme right-wing ideologies. I'd like to present you with some demographic evidence that I think is of relevance to the city's efforts to ensure public safety and to combat hate crimes. American sociologists have noted unprecedented recent demographic tendencies in their country, a decline in average life expectancy over the past 3 years, a near tripling since 1990 of what sociologists call deaths of despair due to suicide, drug overdoses, alcoholism, a near doubling in the same period of white mortality rates.
Sir, sorry, I can tell that you don't seem like you're anywhere near the end, but I should just tell you your time is up, so if you want to just find the last couple of sentences.
I'll just say very briefly that there are disturbing demographic sociological tendencies in the United States that many scholars have been correlating with issues of decline in public health measures, decline in social safety nets, decline in the quality of public education. My concern is that under our present provincial government, Ontario seems to be heading in a similar direction, which one might anticipate can create in the future similar forms of despair and confusion, in particular among young white males.
Okay.
I think this
appreciate that point and all of your other points in your time, and we gave you a bit of extra time to conclude there, and we thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much,
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that. All right. Are there any, I think we've completed the list of deputants, as far as I could tell here, Madam Clerk. We don't have any other names, so I will thank you all for those deputations, and some people for more or less complying with what we were trying to do here in terms of discussion. I would now move to speakers, and I'm going to speak first, if I may. I have a motion. I beg your pardon? I beg your pardon. We've done just deputations. You're quite right. Questions of staff. Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. City of Toronto has the power of trespass, issuing trespass warnings, issuing trespass orders, Is that our own policy, or is that done under the Trespass to Property Act?
The city's authority to issue trespass notices is from the Trespass to Property Act. I should note that's also subject to scrutiny under the charter.
A charter challenge, I think we talked about last time, was $300,000 to $500,000 for an applicant. How often do you think has that happened when the city issues trespass orders?
So I can't comment on the cost of what a litigation would be for an applicant. We have many litigation that has proceeded by individuals that don't even retain legal counsel. Those would obviously be less expensive. So there's a huge range in terms of how much a proceeding would cost.
Now, I see in the report and previous reports that there's a lot of references to the charter. It's always been my understanding when the charter was brought in that judges would interpret the charter. Yet, no offense, but I see our city staff are interpreting the charter. Isn't it left to the judiciary? And isn't there a lot of settled law under the right to assemble?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, obviously our view of the charter is informed by the past judges' decisions. So I think whatever advice we were giving, we would consider that to be consistent with what judges have decided in the past with respect to the charter. I mean, the public report is laying out for the committee as clearly as we can in public session what we see the underlying issues as being for consideration. If we wanted to have a more fulsome discussion of legal issues, including the charter analysis, I would suggest that going in camera would be the most appropriate thing to do.
So back to the trespass power. I mean, I have a couple cases here where, and I'm not going to mention names, don't worry. I guess it was a resident of Toronto had made a racial slur against a staff member, and they were given a trespass order to stay off recreational properties for a year. There was another incident that I've been brought to my attention where someone was given a trespass warning for shouting, cursing, screaming, creating a disturbance, and intimidating staff and residents. It was a warning. And then there was a resident who was going to come to my house, I guess, and they were given a letter from legal not to come to my house, and that they were given notice under the Trespass to Property Act. Now, these are the only situations that I'm aware of. We have this power, yet throughout these reports, staff have not been willing to do this. And I'm just wondering what your reluctance is when people do not follow our permit policy, they don't follow our anti-discrimination policy, they pay no fees. And I'm going to be reading the original motion yesterday that's been spun way out of control regarding white supremacists and neo-Nazis, yet there seems to be this deep reluctance to use that tool.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I frankly am not sure that there's been circumstances where trespass notices haven't been issued where people have failed to follow the policy. I mean, I think the gist of the report from the director is that we have a policy in place and that we do apply it. The instances you've noted sound like individual cases, and maybe my colleague, Mr. Lynch, wants to comment on those. In terms of using trespass as a general remedy in respect, I think, of the broader issues in this report, again, I think maybe a robust discussion on that could be had in camera.
Now, I've had residents come to me about tax arrears, property tax arrears. That's a problem, and the city is not shy about chasing for those monies. Some of these are seniors. Some of these have fallen on hard times. They may be house rich, but they're house poor. Why is the city just really, in the reports, unwilling to go after unpaid fees for road closures, TTC reroutes, police services, solid waste cleanup? I can tell you that some of the great festivals in our city have almost been bankrupted from these fees, yet law-abiding citizens have to pay them and others don't. And the city just seems reluctant to go after them for it.
Again, it's rather difficult, through you, Mr. Mayor, to sort of get into a huge amount of detail with this analysis, but the report does make the point that there's a distinction between permitted events where fees are applied, the non-permitted events that I think we're talking about. It's difficult to answer your question without also acknowledging, as is stated in the report, that there are issues of freedom of expression, an overlay, if you will, that applies to the use of public property such as streets, squares, that kind of thing. There's a historical facet to that, and we'd be happy to talk about that in more detail in camera.
I know that
This will, I'm afraid, yeah, time has expired.
we'll leave it at that.
Other questions of staff? Okay. Thank you. If you had one more, I mean, but you're the only one in it, so we're not taking up a lot of time with this, but then, because we would have a second round from time to time, but one more only, and...
I think you and I both have motions, and
we do.
We'll speak to those.
All right.
And that's fine.
Fine, thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Okay, then we'll move to speakers, and I had indicated that I had a motion and wish to speak first, which I will do, and we'll put the motion up if we can. May I begin by saying that this is obviously, so I'm just trying to reset the clock. There we go. This is obviously a very complex area, and that's because of the, as we've heard repeatedly this morning, the intersection between charter rights and the applications of, say, a permit policy or even the application of a provincial statute like the Trespass to Property Act. We've seen the complexity evidence this morning in the discussion of defining hate and discriminatory speech, which is a constant challenge. And we've seen the complexity of regulating events that don't, for example, recognize a regulatory regime no matter what it is. I want to begin by just acknowledging the efforts of our public service to help us to address these issues. I think notwithstanding writings that we see in different places that suggest there's a simple answer to this, there isn't. It's a very complicated area. I have tried as chair this morning to ensure that today's discussion stayed as focused as possible on the civic issue that we're here to discuss today, and try to avoid the kind of polarized discussion of foreign policy, which can and should take place elsewhere, hopefully in a respectful manner, but which is out of place in a discussion of City of Toronto policy and regulatory responsibility for events that are held in the city and the intersections that I've referred to between those events and charter rights and other things. I am very respectful, and I think all the members of Toronto City Council are, of the right to freedom of speech, to freedom of expression, but it's a matter of law, which I also respect, law duly passed by the Parliament of Canada, that we have allowed under our law and in fact provided for some limitations on freedom of speech as it relates to hate speech. And I think those limitations, based on evidence and due process, because there is a due process to be followed when those provisions of the law are applied, are also respected and supported by the people of Toronto as being reasonable, first and foremost, and as being consistent both with our policies against discrimination and hatred, policies civic, provincial, and federal, but also consistent with prevailing values, especially in this the most diverse and therefore one of the most complex cities of the world in terms of the need for us to make sure that we respect freedom of expression and freedom of religion and a host of other things, but place a reasonable limitation on speech that is hateful or discriminatory. So that is particularly recognized, I think, in light of what's going on around the world in terms of discourse and commentary that repeatedly seems to fall well outside of the bounds of open, honest debate and heads well inside the boundaries of hateful and discriminatory speech, whether we see it at rallies here and elsewhere, whether we see it on social media here and elsewhere, or sometimes even in the mainstream media, where we see people taking great license to impugn reputations and impugn motives, including of elected officials and public servants. And this is really no better, I don't think, than the complaints that we're here to deal with in some respects and try and address today. So all of this has manifested itself in the incidents of hatred that are cataloged by the Toronto Police Service on an annual basis. And the report just came out last week and indicated that in this city last year, incidents of hatred complained of were number 1, affecting the Jewish community, number 2, the Muslim faith, and number 3, the black community. And it was interesting to note that 60% of all the complaints received by police of hateful incidents applied to groups that represented only 21% of the population, which certainly indicates there's a concentration of this kind of speech and these kinds of acts against very defined groups. I should say that on my own part in putting this forward, this resolution, I want to just address a couple of parts of it before I run out of time. I would take and have taken exactly the same position vis-a-vis people who are discriminatory or use hate speech against Muslims or against groups other than the Jewish community, as evidenced by the steps that we take to avoid the holding of white supremacist or neo-Nazi rallies on the very same kinds of public property that we're here talking about today. So and I should say that my resolution here is meant to put in place the same kind of thing that at my initiative initially was undertaken by the library board, namely to put in place a filter for those who choose to apply for permits that says if they have an established history of hateful commentary that goes beyond or outside of the city's hate and discrimination policy, that we could deny them a permit. Secondly, it is meant to address the instance in which people either don't have a permit, either because they've refused to apply for one or because they've denied one, and to suggest something that to me fits entirely within what one of the deputants said today, which is equal rights for all. Because to me, what goes with equal rights for all is equal responsibility for all. And if we have a regime in place that says you apply for a permit when you're using property in the city to have an event, then to me, those who don't have a permit or don't bother to get one or refuse to get one should be prosecuted. There's a rule in place that says you get a permit. If you don't follow the rule, you get prosecuted. And so there are a couple of areas in this resolution that say that we're going to request the Police Services Board to do things because we can't direct them, and that they in turn have to request the police. There's a couple in here that direct our own officials to say we expect, for example, that people will be prosecuted for a failure to follow established city policy. And I think if we did that, that would take us some distance down the road to at least better and in a fair way that respects due process. Because when you prosecute somebody, it simply means they go to court and there's due process that's followed after that. And my final comment will be simply to say that I think we should be taking an approach vis-a-vis how these things are dealt with and put into the process that follows more what we see with domestic violence, where when there's an incident that is alleged and that is backed up by some evidence that a police officer sees, they lay the charge and the disposition of the charge is up to a court and prosecutors to deal with, as opposed to being up to the police to deal with. And I think that would be a fair way to get these dealt with in a fair place, which is in a courtroom where judges are not biased about these issues. So I will stop there and move forward. Anybody wants to ask any questions of me? Because I know you can ask questions on a motion. If not, we'll move on. Okay. Other speakers wishing to address this? Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your leadership on this important file. I do have a motion. If the clerk can put it on the screen, the mayor's office was involved in this as well. I just wanted to remind colleagues, staff, and the members of the public what this original item was when it came to council as an administrative inquiry. And it was simply this, quote, do the police service and City of Toronto have the ability and what resources could they utilize to prohibit a rally that is inciting hatred and violence, such as Al-Quds Day, white supremacist or neo-Nazi rallies, from taking place on city or provincial property? And I think this was an opportunity, really, for Toronto to shine, Toronto to set a civic leadership in making sure that such groups did not take place, such events did not take place on city property. And you know, there's a thin line between banning something and it not taking and not hosting it. As repugnant as hate rallies are, these people were more than welcome to go over to U of T and have their event over there, which is a publicly funded institution. I think that's abhorrent. But the City of Toronto is not interested in hosting these groups. And I should point out, as you'll see from the fifth item in the motion, Bill 84 is working its way through the legislative process at Queen's Park, where they are also working to make sure that hate rallies do not take place at Queen's Park, and we're hoping at the end of the day it'll also expand to all provincial property. The bottom line is you know, you have to have a threshold for hate, and the evidence here is just so overwhelming, certainly with Al-Quds Day. If this isn't hate, then what is? And I can only respond by the vigor of their defensiveness that there are deep concerns, and it's very hard to defend. But also what instigated this whole process was the emergence of white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups within our public spheres. And it's my conclusion from the staff reports and doing research within our office that we do have the tools to stop or deter these events from taking place. We do have the power of trespass warning and trespass enforcement. We do have the power to go after various groups for unpaid fees. It is heartbreaking to see wonderful cultural events in this city suffer enormous hardship because they play by the rules. They pay the TTC routing fees. They pay the lane closure fees. They pay for paid duty or police services fees, solid waste. It adds up into tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they're playing by the rules. And they're contributing to the city. And yet these other groups often do not. They jump onto the public street. They tie up police services who are already stretched to the limit. They spew hate, and then it makes everybody feel that our city is on the wrong path. And I think this was an opportunity to make a strong statement. I should say that we hear about the charter in the reports and staff, and we always have to be reminded of the charter. But the charter, in the context that there are discussions taking place, are the charter of the ability to say what you want. Well, what about rights of others? What about the rights of people to go about their life in peace and dignity and respect without being harassed, without being subject to racial slurs? What about their rights? How do we protect those rights? Well, we go to the courts, which probably didn't go as far as they should have in protecting those rights, but at the same time, we have those interpretations, and those rights are protected, and we can lean that way as well. And if people want to submit a charter challenge to the City of Toronto, bring it on. If they want to put $300,000 to $500,000 in a charter challenge and invest in the years and years to take on the City of Toronto because we are a city of high principle, bring it on. We have a legal team that will fight it, and we will defend the rights of our individual citizens to be respectful, to be tolerant, to back up with law the diversity that we have here. We don't want to fall into the same problems that many urban centers across Europe and across the United States have done. That being said, the conversation is not over with this. These motions are the latest chapter. Our Office of Equity and Human Rights has to bring an annual report. We constantly review the city's anti-discrimination policy. We're going to continue to work on this to make sure that these groups cannot congregate in the City of Toronto, that we're going to use the power of trespass order, and that we're going to use the ability to recover fees and monies lost by the City of Toronto when they don't pay their fair share.
Thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Are there any questions of Councillor Pasternak arising out of his motion? Okay, hearing none. Are there any other speakers on this matter? Okay, then we have two motions in front of us, which, and we'll do them in order. So then the motion that I moved would come first, and we'll just put that up on the screen. And so this motion, as you can see here, would delete the recommendation and replace it with what's set out on the screen and in front of you. So I'll call the question if we're ready for that. All those in favor? We'll have a recorded vote on this.
On motion one by Mayor Tory, all in favor, Mayor Tory, Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong, Councillor Bailao, Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Thompson, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Nziata. That carries unanimously.
Then we have motion number two. I don't think it has a number on it, but the second motion moved by Councillor Pasternak. It's in front of you, and I'll call the question and a recorded vote on that.
On motion two by Councillor Pasternak, all in favor, Mayor Tory, Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong, Councillor Bailao, Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Thompson, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Nziata. That carries unanimously.
And then I think that completes it, actually, because we don't. The item has been amended by the motion. I don't think we need to have a further vote. Okay. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Madam Clerk, that completes the business of the day, unless anybody has any other business that they believe we need to deal with now. So I thank you very much, and thank all the deputies who came to see us today. Meeting's adjourned.